Hello, Gary Rogers here. Welcome to the Spiritual Heritage Channel. Today I'd like to talk to you about a not very well known New Zealand evangelist, Jim Cameron, and his wife Mary. Jim came from a little rural community called Morven in South Canterbury. He trained as an electrician and moved to Wellington, where he got a job working for a large baking company called Griffin's in industrial control. This was an interest he maintained all his life. Jim met Mary in Wellington, and within 3 weeks of meeting her, they got married. After Jim became a Christian, he shared the gospel in the streets of Wellington and was a very effective evangelist. They went to work with youth with a mission, YWAM, and travelled all around the world. While in India, 5 years after joining YWAM, one day Jim felt God speak to him and say, "Jim, you feel you're missing out on things. You feel that you're missing out on things by going around the world and preaching the gospel. What would you really like to do?" Jim said, "I'd like to be manager of Katlahema." They came back to New Zealand a short time afterwards, and Jim became manager of Katlahema, an industrial control firm. You see, God is not just interested in having servants or slaves. God is interested in partnering with us. Jim was still interested in preaching the gospel, and he was known as being very effective at it. A well-known charismatic minister in the USA, Ray Mossholder, very well known in the 1970s, sought Jim out to come and work with him as an evangelist. And so Jim and Mary moved to the USA, and Jim worked as an evangelist. They were part of the Church of the Way, which is a church pastored by Jack Hayford, a very well-known pastor in the USA and around the world. The Church of the Way sent Jim and Mary out to Alaska to plant a church, and they planted a church that grew to over 200 in the city of Anchorage. Jim also worked in the oil fields in industrial control and continued to do this for a number of years. Sadly, Mary became very ill, and in spite of many people around the world praying for her, her condition got worse. She had bowel cancer. They came back to New Zealand, and in Oamaru they bought a big house, a big old manse, and Jim put a lot of love doing this house up for Mary, whom he loved deeply. Not only that, they weren't just thinking of themselves. They built a flat into this house for a missionary friend of theirs, Lorraine, who for many years had ministered to school children in Thailand. One of the things, or a few of the things I remember about Jim, one day I was in a pizzeria with him, and we were having a good time, eating pizza, pulling the stringy cheese out of your mouth, and all of a sudden Jim stopped, and he looked over and he saw a lady, and I could just see sadness in his eyes as he said, "That lady's in trouble." Because Jim had a heart for the lonely and the lost. Another thing I remember, I visited Jim and Mary twice while they were down in Oamaru and Mary was ill. And in spite of Jim having been associated with this big ministry in the USA, and in spite of the troubles he had with Mary being so ill, he was still interested in reaching out to others. When I was there, a German man rang up, and he was feeling depressed and in trouble. And I heard Jim say to him on the phone, why don't you come over and we'll talk about it? Jim told me afterwards that everyone in this town hated this man because this man actually thought that Adolf Hitler was wonderful. But Jim reached out to him. He showed him love. Another thing I remember about Jim was something he used to say. He used to say to me, "Grace is the currency of heaven." I was sure he was wrong because other preachers always said faith was the currency of heaven. But then I realised that faith is the currency we need on earth to reach heaven, to touch the heart of God. A trust. God responds to our trust and our faith. And then through the cross, God pours out grace upon the earth. So the currency that God exchanges for our faith is His grace and favour that He pours out on us. And the cross of Jesus is actually like the money exchange. God exchanges our faith, our trust at the cross, through what Jesus did on the cross, for His grace to be poured out on us. On one of those visits to Oamaru, Jim gave me this photograph here, signed photograph of the Iditarod. This was a race across Alaska with sledges and huskies in the wilderness. Jim and Mary followed this while they were over there. Sadly, Mary died, and Jim went to USA, bought a large BMW bike and travelled around the USA. One day he was biking around a corner and hit a truck, a ute, head on, and was instantly killed. Jim went to be with Jesus and Mary, who he loved. I hope that this story has been an inspiration to you. There are other stories on similar subjects on the Spiritual Heritage channel, if you would like to look at those. Thank you for listening.